Bonsoir mesdames et messieurs et bienvenue à la dernière séance de la 6e saison de Recherche en univers à l'école de musique Schulich. Good evening ladies and gentlemen and welcome to the last session of the 6th season of Research Alive at the Schulich School of Music. My name is Stephen McAdams and I co-created this season with Kit Soden. With this series we aim to bring alive the humanistic, scientific and engineering research in music as well as the research that goes on behind the scenes in composition and performance. Today's session is presented by the winner of our yearly Research Alive Student Prize competition, generously funded by Jill de Villafranca and Dr. David Custer. It takes place with contrabassist and musicologist Shanti Nachtergaele. We still have 2 satellite research events with the 2 finalist projects from the Student Prize competition. Music theorist Thomas Posen will present in the graduate colloquium of the Music Research Department on March 19th, and then composers Gabriel Dufour-Lacarrière, Philippe Séguin, and Dominique Lafortune will present with the McGill Association of Student Composers meeting on March 25th. You can find the links for these events on the Schulich School of Music events calendar. We are already preparing the 7th season of Research Alive, so check back in the fall for some new and exciting presentations of research in music scholarship and practice. The title of Shanti's talk this evening is Changing Notes for Notability, Re-enacting a Legendary Performance by Domenico Dragonetti and Ludwig van Beethoven. So please join me in welcoming Shanti Nachtergaele.
I would like to begin by acknowledging that McGill University is located on unceded indigenous land known as Nachtergaele, or Montreal. The Kanyankaaga of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy are the traditional custodians of these lands and waters, which have also served as a place of meeting and exchange for many First Nations. I make this statement in recognition that our presence on this land is but one outcome of an ongoing colonial legacy, and as a first step in interrogating the diverse effects of these under-acknowledged colonial histories. My presentation today revolves around 2 virtuosos and the story of their first encounter in Vienna in 1799. You may recognize the image on the left as a young Ludwig van Beethoven, but this isn't the tormented genius composer that most people think of when they hear the name Beethoven. In 1799, Beethoven was 28 years old and at the height of his career as a pianist. This is Beethoven before he premiered his first symphony or published his first set of string quartets, and before significant hearing loss caused him to give up his performance career. On the right, you see double bass virtuoso Domenico Dragonetti. Dragonetti may not be a household name today, but at the time he was at least as famous as Beethoven, having made a name for himself in his hometown of Venice before moving to London in 1794. In addition to his musical abilities, Dragonetti also demonstrated considerable skill at self-promotion. He went to great lengths to build and protect his public image and maintained an active performance career until just a few months before his death at the age of 83. Like many others at the time, Dragonetti was fond of sharing anecdotes about his feats of musical prowess. The most famous of these anecdotes tells of Dragonetti meeting Beethoven for the first time while he was traveling through Vienna in 1799. Several versions of the anecdote survive, but the most popular account appears in the seminal biography of Beethoven written by Alexander Wheelock Thayer. Samuel Appleby, Dragonetti's friend of 50 years, recounted the story to Thayer as follows. Beethoven had been told that his new friend could execute violoncello music upon his huge instrument, and one morning when Dragonetti called at his room, he expressed his desire to hear a sonata. The contrabass was sent for, and the Sonata No. 2 of Opus 5 was selected. Beethoven played his part, with his eyes immovably fixed upon his companion, and, in the finale, where the arpeggios occur, was so delighted and excited that at the close he sprang up and threw his arms around both player and instrument. The anecdote is unusually specific in that it identifies not only the work that Dragonetti and Beethoven performed together, which is Beethoven's Cello Sonata in G minor, Opus 5 No. 2, but also a specific section in that work, the arpeggio passages in the last movement, which I've highlighted on this slide. Taking this anecdote as a starting point, my presentation will explore 2 questions. First, what would this performance have sounded like? And second, why would Dragonetti choose to play this particular sonata in the first place? Since the sonata mentioned in the anecdote was originally written for cello and not double bass, Dragonetti would have had to adapt it to his instrument through the process of transcription or arrangement in order to play it with Beethoven. This wasn't the only time that Dragonetti borrowed repertoire from other instruments, so I'll start my talk by giving an overview of the contexts in which Dragonetti performed works originally written for other instruments. The second part of my presentation will explore the types of changes Dragonetti would have made to the cello part of Beethoven's sonata in order to play it on double bass, more specifically on his 3-string double bass. Dragonetti unfortunately did not leave a notated transcription of the cello part, so I have transcribed the work myself. I'll talk about how both the features of Dragonetti's instrument and his individual performance idiom influenced my transcription, and I'll demonstrate a few of the techniques I used to adapt the cello part of Beethoven's sonata in the style of Dragonetti. I'll end the presentation by performing my transcription of the final movement of the sonata with forte pianist Meagan Milatz. The terms transcription and arrangement will come up a lot during my presentation. Both terms refer to adapting a piece originally written for one instrument or an ensemble of instruments to be played on a different instrument or instruments. For the purposes of my talk, the distinction between transcriptions and arrangements is not very important, and you can think of these terms as essentially interchangeable. While transcriptions and arrangements make up a significant portion of the double bass's repertoire today, no one before Dragonetti is known to have adapted music written for other instruments to the double bass. Even more remarkably, it was Dragonetti's arrangements rather than his compositions that became his signature repertoire as a virtuoso. Although he composed several concertos and other solos for double bass, Dragonetti stopped performing these works in public with rare exception in 1801. And as I mentioned earlier, his performance career continued until the 1840s. For Dragonetti, transcriptions and arrangements were a way to create performance opportunities and build his reputation. The anecdote I shared earlier portrays the performance of Beethoven's cello sonata as a spontaneous event. However, as I created my own transcription of the work, I began to suspect that Dragonetti played a more active role than Appleby describes in setting up the opportunity to play with Beethoven, as well as in making sure that people heard about his accomplishment. While the extent to which Dragonetti orchestrated the events described in the anecdote remains a matter of speculation, it is clear that his performance with Beethoven and the anecdote it inspired fit into his overall strategy of self-promotion. The earliest documented instances of Dragonetti co-opting repertoire from other instruments involved the celebrated Italian violinist Giovanni Battista Viotti, who arrived in London 2 years before Dragonetti, and like Dragonetti, found considerable success there. Another popular anecdote tells of Dragonetti playing violin duets with Viotti, Dragonetti playing the second violin part on double bass. The pair were advertised twice as performing one of Viotti's violin duets, first in May 1797 and again in February 1798. A review of the 1798 performance remarked that, quote, "The chief effort of the night was the duet between Viotti and Dragonetti. Viotti's great execution on the violin was wonderfully seconded by Dragonetti on the double bass. Unfortunately, just the following month, Viotti was ordered to leave Britain as a suspected Jacobin sympathizer, and the promising partnership was forced to come to an end." Dragonetti must have realized he was onto something because he turned to another colleague at the King's Theatre, the cellist Robert Lindley. Dragonetti and Lindley became a staple of London concert life for several decades, celebrated for their dependability in laying down a solid foundation in orchestral music, for their manner of accompanying opera recitatives without the added support of a keyboard instrument, and for their popular duo and trio arrangements of Baroque chamber repertoire. The two first performed a sonata by Corelli at a concert in June 1799, which would have been shortly after Dragonetti's return from Vienna and the now famous performance of Beethoven's cello sonata. Dragonetti and Lindley played arrangements for cello and double bass of Corelli's violin sonatas for several decades, and these performances reached their height of popularity in the 1820s and 1830s. Lindley would play the violin part, and Dragonetti would play the bass line, both an octave lower than originally written. Among the works that became most closely associated with the pair was Corelli's Violin Sonata, Opus 5, number 9. When Dragonetti and Lindley were granted the distinction of being the first musicians profiled in the Musical World series of orchestral sketches, their biographies were accompanied by a portrait of the pair, quote, playing their favorite Corelli sonata. A few years later, the sonata remained just as popular. A review from 1839 reads, quote, Lindley and Dragonetti played their old sonata in A in a manner that would have astonished Corelli, the former indulging in all those licenses of roulade and ornament, against which both good taste and the genius of the old Italian school have long pleaded in vain. The latter, Dragonetti, articulating the divisions of the running bass with an aplomb and distinctness that are the admiration of all hearers on every succeeding repetition. It's not clear whether or not Dragonetti's divisions of the running bass were the same every time he and Lindley performed Opus 5, number 9. He might have played different versions with varying levels of embellishment throughout his career. Only one version survives in notation, found among the collection of manuscripts left to Vincent Novello in Dragonetti's will. Novello added brief inscriptions to many of these manuscripts. And this one reads, quote, this is evidently intended by Dragonetti as a variation to the famous quick movement at the end of Corelli's 9th solo, for his incomparable performances of which Dragonetti was so justly celebrated. So now I'll play just the first two phrases of the bass line of this piece. First I'll play the original bass line, and then I'll play Dragonetti's running divisions. Dragonetti utilized arrangement to increase demand for his participation in other chamber music contexts as well. He often played in large chamber works for 5 to 9 players, some of which included a part originally written for double bass. However, when no double bass was called for, Dragonetti regularly substituted for a second cello, a practice that reportedly convinced George Onslow to include a double bass part as an alternate to the second cello in a revised edition of his quintets. Additionally, Dragonetti's arrangements of J.S. Bach's organ music served as an investment opportunity with the potential for returns on multiple fronts. With many English organs of the time lacking pedals, Dragonetti financed the publication of several of Bach's organ works with the pedal part arranged for cello or double bass. On the one hand, the addition made this repertoire more accessible to English organists and fortepianists at a time when English tastes were primed to embrace Bach's music. And on the other, the arranged pedal part created yet another channel for Dragonetti's engagement in performances of chamber music, which in turn provided additional advertising for the edition itself. So by now it should be clear that Dragonetti often played music that was originally written for other instruments, and more importantly, that his transcriptions and arrangements played a significant part in his extended and lucrative performance career. This final example is perhaps the most relevant to my goal of reconstructing the performance by Beethoven and Dragonetti that is described in the anecdote. While Dragonetti did not leave us a notated transcription of Beethoven's Cello Sonata number 2 of Opus 5, which is identified in the anecdote, we do have a surviving transcription that he prepared of another work by Beethoven, the Violin Sonata in A major, Opus 47, which you might know as the Kreutzer Sonata or the Bridge Tower Sonata. Novello also added in an inscription to this manuscript, which reads, quote, I have now the pleasure of presenting this autograph of Il Caro Drago as a little keepsake on my approaching departure for Italy To my highly esteemed friend and amateur double bass player, Mr. Whitaker of Barning, who will, I know, justly appreciate the superior skill of this adaptation of Beethoven's famous composition to the compass and capability of the contrabass. Before I can talk about what it means to adapt a piece of music to the compass and capability of the contrabass, I need to speak a little bit about Dragonetti's instrument. Like many Italian performers in the 18th and 19th centuries, Dragonetti played 3-string double basses for most of his career. The standard modern double bass, pictured on the right, has 4 strings and is tuned in fourths. So from highest to lowest, the strings are G, D, A, and E. Dragonetti's bass, on the left, was also tuned in fourths, but its 3 strings were the same as the top 3 on a modern bass. So we have G, D, and A. Since it is missing the extra low string, a low E, the 3-string bass has a slightly narrower range than a modern bass. The benefit of this setup is that it allows for a wider spacing between strings and higher individual string tension, which results in a more powerful sound. So I've modified the setup of my instrument to emulate Dragonetti's as closely as possible. My instrument was originally built with a 5-string setup, but last year I had a second neck built that allows me to switch back and forth between 5 and 3 strings. And you might also be able to see that I'm playing with gut strings as Dragonetti would have. Gut strings have a reputation for being lower tension and quieter than modern metal strings, but Dragonetti was known for using very thick strings. Therefore, the strings I'm using are also quite a bit thicker than what most gut string players would use, and the tension is actually about the same as it would be with modern strings. So the other interesting thing about Dragonetti's setup is that he used what's called a Dragonetti bow. My bow isn't quite a Dragonetti bow. I don't know if you can see this, but there's pictures on the slide. This is a later bow from England, but it still shows the influence of Dragonetti in England. It has a pretty wide space between the stick and the hair, and it has this pretty blunt tip, which is characteristic of the Dragonetti bow. But like a modern bow, it's curved inward a little bit rather than curved outward. And just to show very quickly, a modern bow curved inward, very little space between the stick and the hair, and a tip that kind of swoops out at the end. So when Novello refers to the compass of the double bass, he's referring to how high or how low it can play. We call this the range of an instrument generally today. Before I get too far into that, I should explain a few relevant terms. On string instruments, the left hand and the right hand tend to do very different things. So looking now at the role of the left hand and how we play notes, we first have open strings, which don't require the left hand at all, except to stop the note from ringing. We have what's called stopped notes, when the left hand presses down the string. And then we have harmonics, which are what happens when you just touch the string in specific places. Instead of pressing down, you get notes. And the most important one is exactly halfway between the nut and the bridge, and it gives you the octave above the open string. So thinking especially about this harmonic, we can divide the compass or range of the bass into 3 main areas. The first is the neck position. So anytime the thumb is behind the neck of the instrument here, we have the low to middle registers of the instrument, and we call these the neck positions. So now when I get to the octave G harmonic, I put my thumb on it, and we start what's called the thumb positions. And from there, we have the higher registers of the instrument. And then if we want to keep going, we can play higher harmonics that reach above the fingerboard. So when we look at Dragonetti's music, we see that he did use the entire range of his instrument, from the lowest open string all the way up to the high harmonics. But I also noticed that he uses the different registers of the bass, so he uses the neck positions, the thumb positions, and the high harmonics in different ways. Dragonetti's works indicate a preference for the low to middle registers of his instrument, which means the notes played in the neck positions and low thumb position, when thumb is on octave G, the octave G harmonic. He tends to center melodic material between the open D string and this octave G harmonic, occasionally venturing a few notes lower or higher. He reserved the higher register, so the thumb positions, for special effects, mostly scales and flourishes that would show off his technical abilities. Dragonetti's approach to the instrument is quite different from what we see in later double bass repertoire and in modern transcriptions, which often stay mostly in the higher register and thumb position. I'll play two examples to show how Dragonetti used the different registers. So the first is his Waltz number 11. And what you should hear in this piece is that he's mostly staying in the low and middle registers, and then in the B section, he has a few scales that go up to the thumb position, and the very highest note is at the end of the B section before the return of the theme. My second example is an excerpt from a piece that he labeled Larghetto or Adagio in two versions, and I'm not going to play the whole thing. This is just the A section. It's essentially constructed of two phrases, and each phrase is played first in the neck positions and then in harmonics. But what's interesting about this is that he totally skips the higher register and the thumb positions. Dragonetti's use of the different registers of the double bass are part of his idiom, or individual performance style. The tendencies I just demonstrated in his own compositions also appear in his transcriptions. Looking now at the transcription process itself, Novello refers to adapting Beethoven's Violin Sonata to the, quote, compass and capability of the contrabass. The most fundamental technique that Dragonetti uses is transposition, which applies mainly to compass. To transpose music means to move passages or whole works up or down from the original so that they fit the range of your instrument. So if we have a popular motive, we can transpose that one octave lower, and then one more octave lower. And at this point, I've run out of octaves, so I'll stop. Okay. In his transcription of Beethoven's Violin Sonata, Dragonetti transposed everything down to fit the compass of his instrument. Most passages are 2 octaves lower, and some are 3 octaves lower than the original violin part. In the Cello Sonata, most passages fit into Dragonetti's preferred register when they are transposed 1 octave lower than written. However, since the range of a 3-string double bass does not extend a full octave below the cello, some passages must be played in the original octave, or at pitch. So if we think about the open strings on a cello, which are C, G, D, and A, just thinking about the lowest one, C, the double bass, or Dragonetti's double bass, I should say, only goes a few notes lower. And then the rest of the octave is not there anymore. Moving on to what Novello refers to as the capability of the double bass, sometimes just moving a passage lower isn't enough. Since the double bass is so much bigger than the violin, notes are much further apart on the instrument. Dragonetti's transcription therefore features a number of changes that reconfigure notes to bring them closer together. This is especially noticeable when the original part features chords or repetitive figurations with large leaps. So in example 1, we have the opening of the Violin Sonata, and what I've marked on the score here is that Dragonetti removes some notes, which I've crossed out in red, and then he moves other notes closer together. And what you'll notice in most of my examples is that the open strings are very helpful, and I've highlighted these in orange to kind of show when they're useful. So going back to example 1, Dragonetti doesn't just remove notes, he also changes the contour of the first bar. So playing, and the contour I've marked in blue with a blue line. So playing the first chord of the violin part, or it's much lower, obviously. Has 4 notes, but Dragonetti reduces this to 3. And you might expect a double bassist to play the first bar of this piece like this. But Dragonetti changes the contour and starts with a much lower chord. So his first 3 notes, or his first chord, is those notes. And I'll play the whole first 4 bars now. In example 2, we see a similar principle applied to arpeggios, essentially just moving notes closer together. So in this example, the violin would play 2-octave arpeggios. But Dragonetti decides again to change the contour, so this is again marked with blue lines, he changes the contour and just compresses everything to fit into one octave. In example 3, we have two problems. The first is that the notes are very far apart, which you'll see again with a very widely wavy contour line. I'll play just the first line now. And at this point, we've reached our second problem, which is that we've run out of notes going down. So the A flat that is circled in red is too low to continue. And Dragonetti solves both of these problems by just moving around the octaves in which he plays these notes. So he's playing the same pitches, but he's putting them in whichever octave puts them closest together physically for the left hand. This changes the contour, which I've annotated again in blue. But you'll notice that in the first bar, compared to the third and fourth bars, that the first bar still has a wider contour, and that's because Dragonetti can use open strings. So this is the whole excerpt. In example 4, we have what's called a bariolage technique, which on a string instrument means alternating between two strings every other note. So what you'll see is that I've boxed the lower notes in the line in purple, and those are played on one string, and then the A's, which are kind of a static drone, are boxed in blue on the next string over. You could find a way to just transpose the violin part, and that would sound like this. But Dragonetti does not do this. He doesn't want to play wide leaps in thumb position. So he moves everything lower, and he flips the static A and puts that at the bottom using the open A string, and then he puts the moving line up above. So you'll see the X and the boxes, and I hope that makes sense. I'll demonstrate that now. And you might remember from waltz number 11 that I played just a few minutes ago that it has some bariolage technique as well. So in the B section, there were a few passages. First this one, and then later on. So this is obviously something Dragonetti liked to do, and especially liked to use the open strings to do it. And then in example 5, we see that Dragonetti is willing to completely change notes to make a passage more idiomatic. So instead of the 3 descending notes in the violin part, which are boxed, they sound like this. He plays an arpeggio that just outlines the same harmony as the violin part. So Dragonetti's transcription sounds like this. Now moving on to my own transcription, I applied the same techniques to the cello sonata. I'll start again by demonstrating a few chords. So in example 6, we have a nice 4-note chord, which on the cello has these notes. And I've decided to bring everything closer together in the lower register and play these notes. In example 7, we have some 3-note chords, which on the cello would sound like this, or would have these notes in them. And I again bring them lower by flipping the top 2 notes, and I also use the open G string to make this fit under the hand. And finally, in example 8, which is the second to last note in the piece, we have another 4-note chord on the cello, would be these notes. And I bring it lower and I bring it closer together, and I use the open G and the G harmonic. So in example 9, we have the passage which is mentioned in the anecdote when Appleby says, in the finale where the arpeggios occur. That's example 9 right here. So in the cello part, the notes would be like this. And I do the exact same thing I did with chords. I use the open G string, and then I flip the top 2 notes, and I play them lower and closer together. Example 10 is kind of a different problem. Here we have a passage that covers a pretty wide range. Each figuration would cover 2 octaves. And if we want to put the first one in Dragonetti's preferred register, so in the neck positions, we end up running out of notes at the bottom. So I'll demonstrate that. And then the last note you could transpose up an octave, but it would be a little bit jarring to do that. So my solution to this is to imitate the effect of the flourish, but reverse direction. So I decide to go up in the second half instead of continuing downwards. And this changes the contour, as I've mentioned many times. In example 11, we have a very similar problem. We are running out of notes in the low register in this passage in octaves. So I've circled the notes that are too low, and you could decide to play just those notes up an octave, and that would sound like this. But I think that that kind of ruins the effect. This passage is right at the end, and it's really nice to keep the octaves going, so I've decided to transpose the pairs of octaves up an octave, and it sounds like this. And the reason that I can do that is because there are many open strings available to me and the octave G harmonic. In this example, example 12, this is really one of the only places where I think Dragonetti would have chosen to play in the higher register. If you want to play this in the lower register, it kind of messes up the descending sequence, which I've marked with brackets. So you have a figure that starts on B, and then you play it starting on A. But then you run out of notes to play starting on the G below that. So I play this up an octave. And the reason that I think Dragonetti might have done this also is because it looks very similar to a passage in his Waltz number 11. So it's essentially a scale with a few appoggiaturas thrown in, if you remember this passage from the Waltz. It even goes up to the same highest note of an E. And now, as a final example, this is a counterexample to example 12. This is an excerpt that I would definitely not want to play in the higher register, even though it goes to the same highest note of an E. And it's because of these two passages that I've boxed in red, which are an ascending arpeggio and a little turn figuration. If you want to play these in the high register, it sounds like this. And how I've chosen to play it is an octave lower, and actually 2 octaves lower than it sounds on the cello. Now, before I perform my full transcription, I'd like to circle back again to what I learned from transcribing this cello sonata in the style of Dragonetti. This process revealed the possible motivations behind Dragonetti's choices, both with respect to how he might have played the cello part on double bass and why he would have wanted to. The sonata is in fact quite idiomatic to the double bass. Even though the cello part requires changes, these adaptations are intuitive and follow straightforward patterns. One of the things that makes the sonata so readily adaptable to the double bass is that it's in the key of G. The tonic G and the dominant D, which are the most important structural notes in the key, correspond to the top 2 strings of the double bass, which makes it possible to use open strings and the octave harmonic to facilitate passages that would otherwise present a much greater challenge. Looking at Beethoven's works for piano and cello, the G minor sonata was not Dragonetti's only option at the time when he first met Beethoven in 1799. It's worth noting that he did not opt to play Beethoven's cello sonata in F major, Opus 5, number 1. The F major sonata is less idiomatic and less intuitively adaptable to the double bass. Since the double bass's open strings do not correspond to the tonic F and dominant C, there are fewer possibilities for open string solutions to chords, arpeggios, and large leaps. Therefore, I propose that Dragonetti deliberately chose the G minor sonata over the F major sonata, and that he did so because it would look and sound impressive without necessarily being overly difficult to play. By putting on an impressive display for a fellow virtuoso like Beethoven, Dragonetti could bolster his reputation and gain a valuable contact in Vienna. More importantly, perhaps, it gave him a good story to tell his friends back home in London, a story that continues to be told to this day. So now I'll invite Meagan to the stage and we'll perform the last movement of Beethoven's cello sonata in G minor. Thanks for tuning in to my presentation.
Did you have to adjust the keyboard part at all to accommodate the transcription?
Sorry. So the question was, did I change the keyboard part at all?
Yeah,
for
to
this?
accommodate the transcription.
I did not. I don't know if Megan did. I don't think so. She's nodding no. So no.
Okay, and another question. Have you considered or are you planning to transcribe works by other composers?
I don't know. I've done a few arrangements in the past for ensembles and things, but yeah, if I find something interesting, I will. So maybe, I guess, is the answer.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.